So good morning. My name is Dr. Walter Grayson at Monmouth University in the Department of Educational Counseling and Leadership. I'm very pleased to be a part of this conference and say thank you to the conference organizers as well as my fellow panelists who have done so much work to shed light on the history of the 369th Regiment, specifically in the context of World War II. And my part in the project, at least in the last few months, has been uncovering the history of the 369th Armory, which is a really unique site and ties together a number of unspoken aspects of African American history and American history that are vital for us to discuss in the coming decade. So the title of the talk is the 369th Armory, which is located on 145th Street and 5th Avenue in Harlem, right along Harlem River Drive. And it is a testament to the importance of historic preservation and the unique moment that really unfolded in the United States between 1920 and 1960. Much of what we think about in terms of the civil rights movement is situated in the Deep South, the movement of Martin Luther King to Atlanta, back with his family, and then ultimately to Birmingham, Alabama. But there's a northern civil rights struggle that laid the foundation for what we think about with Rosa Parks and Ella Baker and Martin Luther King in the 50s and 60s. And this particular site is central to that story of northern civil rights struggle, in that the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Regiment in World War I, that has been documented at some length and I believe is a subject of a forthcoming feature film, that group of men blazed a trail that really aligns with our understanding of the emergence of Alain Locke's idea of the new Negro. And the new Negro as a formulation is someone who rejects the accommodationist policies of Booker T. Washington, who aligns themselves with the ambitions of W.E.B. DuBois, who basically stands up and says they will not accept the continuation of racial violence against African Americans any longer. And this is in the context of the emergence of the second Ku Klux Klan. The initial Klan was born in 1866 and was part of the movement to restore the Southern Democratic Party to power, terrorizing Republicans, black and white, into submission by 1876. That Klan had largely disappeared prior to 1915. 1915 was the release of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation movie, and the popularity of the film, the sophistication of the cinematography, inspired a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan that came to stand for American patriotism and xenophobia, really the fact that immigrants didn't belong in the United States, and most of all, that people of African descent were a blight. They were a disease that had to be expunged from the American landscape. And so in that context, Alain Locke is proposing that African Americans should stand up and defend themselves using every means at their disposal. And that's a really controversial proposition. To publicly acknowledge that the intellectual, cultural, and military strength of the people of African descent in the United States must be shown. You'll probably associate that more with Marcus Garvey and the Black nationalist philosophies of the 1920s. But all of this is coming about in the emergence of a 20th century where for the last 100 or 120 years, any attempt by African Americans to defend themselves was met with massive individual and state violence. That the conflicts around either the Nat Turner Revolt or the Denmark Vesey Revolt, the rejection of David Walker's appeal for colored citizens, people of African descent, to become equal on their own terms in North America, all of that was suppressed actively with gunfire and bombings and attacks to kind of disrupt and destroy anything that looked like functional black community in the 19th century. This culminates in 1919 in the wake of World War I with a series of riots across the United States, dozens of them, where essentially it's called the Red Summer, and the worst of the riots is in Chicago, where African-American neighborhoods are systematically destroyed across the country. And so the worst of these incidences as they unfolded into the 1920s have gained some notoriety in the last 30 years. Rosewood, Florida, there was a feature film made about that. There was also this story of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was bombed and burned to the ground with hundreds of casualties. And so that tradition of the combination of individual violence, harassment, mob action, combined with state-sanctioned violence, where states took action to dismantle these kinds of places. All of this comes up against Alain Locke's idea of the new Negro, that there is a new generation of African Americans who are going to build extraordinary places for themselves and their families, and these communities will persist. Most people focus on the Harlem Renaissance in terms of its artistic expressions, but for the purpose of this talk, we need to focus on a really groundbreaking book by Akinyele Umoja, a professor at Georgia State, whose book, We Will Shoot Back, looks at the documentary evidence of African Americans fighting back against this kind of oppression. Between 1920 and 1933, the 369th Regiment is honored for their valor in World War I, with the state and federal government building an armory for them to keep as their permanent base of operations. In Harlem, an all-black regiment has a base of operations to store their firearms and their armor and their uniforms so that they can then advance the cause of their own self-determination and protection of this community in the northern part of Manhattan. I hope that you realize in the context of what I just said, that's almost unreal. It's fantastic to understand that for more than a decade, there was this affirmation that the valor of African Americans could have a home. And so this Art Deco style building, 5 floors, multiple kinds of offices, marshaling space on the ground floor. I hope to be able to share with you guys in this video some of the photographs of both the exterior and the interior. But that space is crucial to the realization of the dreams of the Harlem Renaissance. That, in fact, African Americans could stand up and defend themselves and have a base of operations to rally for all kinds of activity, including civil rights activity, but community education programs, being able to come and rally and find jobs and build new businesses. As a response to the kind of terrorism we see in Tulsa and in Rosewood, the 369th Armory is a site of Black dignity. And for the purposes of the film project, this is enormous because as it's completed in the early 1930s, 1933, 1934, it serves as a jumping off point for the involvement of African Americans in both the first and the second New Deal. And as these veterans are participating in these state and federal programs to attempt to rebuild the economy, to promote economic stability in Harlem, that then teaches their children the importance of their work. That young men begin to go off and fight in Ethiopia to prove that they are able to carry the banner of the Harlem Hellfighters. That the subjects of our film, as young men, 13, 14, 15, they're aspiring to achieve what their parents had done, what their fathers had done. And that they're coming into the 1940s and the World War II moment steeped in a tradition that's tied into their military ability, into this military vision of themselves as arming and running their own businesses and defending their own homes in a way that lays the foundation for what will become the civil rights movement of the North between 1945 and 1965. That their valor for this second generation of Hellfighters is manifested in this building. The Armory becomes the site for what is commonly referred to in the Black press as the W.E.B campaign. Victory abroad against fascism and Hitler and Tojo. Victory at home against Jim Crow and the establishment for the first time of equal rights for all people. That's what the Armory means. It's this rare place where the Harlem Renaissance manifests as a physical structure and lives out the vision of equality for African Americans on their own terms. And so I hope that's helpful. I'll be available on Twitter throughout the day and into the evening to answer any other questions about the Armory and its unique history. But without it, we get a very different portrait of the 20th century, specifically in New York City. Thank you so much, and I look forward to talking with you more.